Day 4. 0000 hours to 0400 hours. It was a dark world, full of ferocious half-glimpsed nightmares and strange dreams. In the 12 hours since they had landed on the planet, Chopra had felt the strong presence of evil. He had been brought onto the planet for his ability to read minds and foretell the future. However, this special talent was more of a curse. Chopra looked at his fellow Chthons. There were 11 of them. They were small, wizened creatures, naked and hairless, with skin like ancient papyrus. No matter what their age, they appeared, walked, and talked like very old men. They were the original inhabitants of this planetary system. They were all deeply pessimistic, due to centuries of slavery and horrific maltreatment, most recently by the human colonists. After the 7 planets gained independence from the corporation, the Academy had issued a decree which gave the Chthons their freedom and equal status with the colonists. However, on the furthest reaches of the star system, the Chthons continued to be imprisoned and sold by slave traders. Nothing changes, thought Chopra. The Chthons had been brought to this unnamed planet by the shape-changers Butler and Swarf. The shape-changers were midgets. They wore small, dark, one-piece overalls, had round, smiling faces, vast overweight bellies, and bald heads. They had a constipated walk and pig-like facial expressions. They appeared ageless and looked like contorted children's toys. "Why are we here?" Chopra had asked. "Drugs," Swarf had replied. They were not going to let him in on their plans. There would then be a possibility of him leading a mutiny. Chopra sensed something monitoring them in the upper atmosphere. He watched 4 figures slip from the relative safety of the heavens down to the unknown dangers of this poisonous world. They would almost certainly die at the hands of the shape-changers, thought Chopra. The parachutes opened, and the figures slowed down in mid-air. "They've tracked us down, Mr. Swarf," Butler said, in a squeaky high voice. "Indeed, Mr. Butler, but no surprises there," the other dwarf calmly replied. "Let's lose them," Butler suggested. Swarf shook his head to disagree. "All right, I'll just keep an eye on them," Butler continued, tittering to himself. Butler indicated to the Chthons that they should continue the journey. They picked up the metallic box and, without speaking, placed it across their shoulders. They were struggling. The coffin-shaped object they carried was difficult to balance and walk with at the same time. Chopra did not know why they had brought the warhead to the planet. He could not read the minds of the 2 shape-changers. Apart from some life forms, which had a natural ability to protect their thoughts from those with psi ability, androids and a few enormously powerful individuals could deliberately cloud their minds and defend the deepest recesses of their consciousness. Swarf walked to where Chopra knelt on the floor. Chopra was exhausted. The power coming through him was causing him intense pain. He could feel a painful throbbing in his forehead. He pulled the stones out of a little pocket sack and held them tightly in his hands. The primitive 12 stones had runic symbols chiselled into the rock. He shook the stones, threw them onto the ground, and looked at the patterns in front of him. He knew what the shapes would augur. "What does it say?" the shape-changer asked. "Death. For 2 weeks now, it has been the same message again and again, and it is getting stronger. Death and destruction, the end of all things, Armageddon." Chopra began to cough, and felt blood and phlegm coming up from deep inside him. Swarf put his hand on the Chthon's left shoulder and tried to reassure him. "But think of the money." Although it took him several moments to come to his senses, Thomas had survived the parachute drop. The planet was horrific, worse than he had imagined. The jungle had a stench of rotting vegetables and was dark and unfriendly. The light from the twin suns, caught by the huge trees and their canopy of leaves, barely touched the planet's surface. He folded the parachute and sprayed it with acid from his body armor to erase any evidence of his arrival on the planet. He was breathing through the armor's portable air supply. He checked the dials and found the atmosphere breathable, although a little high in nitrogen. He turned the machine off and took a few seconds to become used to the stale, natural air. The portable laser cannon was strapped to his back. He slid it out of his holster and made sure the firing mechanism was still in order. The small dial on his wrist registered 2 androids within close proximity. He set off walking, but within moments found himself back where he had landed on the planet. He had walked in a circle. It was going to be a struggle to wade through the undergrowth. The broken branches, his footprints on the grey volcanic earth, and the noise of his struggle through the undergrowth would signal his location in the jungle. He wondered how they were going to sneak up on the shape changes to carry out their mission and annihilate them. And then he felt the barrel of a staser gun against the back of his head. Someone had sneaked up on him. He stood perfectly still, not able to tell if the owner's finger was tight against the trigger. If he sensed the gunman relaxing, he would turn at speed and disable him. It would be a matter of hundredths of a second. As long as he kept calm, he could overcome the power and speed of a weapon. "Hello, lover boy," Marilyn's voice whispered in his ear. She had survived. He sensed her take a couple of steps back. He turned to face her, the staser still pointed at his forehead. "Put it away. We've lost the commander," Cheney muttered. He was checking the portable flamethrower. He looked at Thomas. "Our weapons need to be totally reliable. Out here we won't have a second chance." Marilyn slid the hand weapon back into her body armor. She was carrying the heat-seeking equipment and was armed with minimal offensive weaponry. Thomas shivered. His fellow androids had managed to approach him, and he hadn't sensed them. They had also lost their commander early in the mission. If they saw Spike, they would have to destroy him. He could be one of the shape changers, trying to infiltrate the small unit. Thomas turned to his 2 companions. He realized that it might be too late, and the shape changers could already be in front of him. "The air is particularly heavy tonight," he said, waiting for the agreed answer. Both Cheney and Marilyn looked puzzled, but did reply. "We're waiting for a thunderstorm." "The Great Bear has escaped from the zoo." They were his companions, although he felt far from safe with Marilyn at his side. There was a very uncomfortable feeling in his guts, a stretching pain. He dismissed it. He had an intellectual fascination with emotions and liked to pretend that he could also feel. However, the only purpose of their programming was to increase their ability to predict their enemy's behavior. They were near perfect killing machines. "We have to find the body," said Thomas. "Without it, we can't be sure." "We don't need to know. It'll only slow down the mission," replied Cheney, in his matter-of-fact tone. "I have another signal," Marilyn reported. 2 humanoid-sized life forms moving slowly about 2 kilometers to the west. Cheney started to move, certain that his companions would follow him. The jungle sprawled for thousands of miles and, as far as she could see, the trees grew up to the sky. Bernice thought that this is what the ancient woods were like in the fairy stories her father read to her as a child. She wouldn't have chosen to go there dressed in green combat trousers and t-shirt. She wouldn't describe herself as prettily dressed, but what the mud and sharp grasses were doing to her was unacceptable. Where were they now? This was an uncharted planet, according to the Doctor, but, unusually for him, he had no further information about their present location. The TARDIS had crash-landed on a planet on the fringes of the Alphosian system, and all the electronic equipment had ceased to function. The Doctor had reasoned that it was not the erratic time machine which was at fault, or his bizarre repairs, but an unidentified power source on the planet. Had he considered the sheer size of this planet, Bernice wondered. "Doctor, wait up," she said. He stopped, turning on one foot. Where are we going?" "Looking to the future. You could easily have asked, where have we come from?" the Doctor said. The Doctor dangled a yo-yo to the ground, but the toy refused to return to his hand. He had broken it. Bernice could get very impatient with her companion when he acted like a small child, played with his toys, and beamed that idiotic grin. "We'll know when we arrive," he added. "My feet are getting very muddy, and I'm awfully tired." Bernice knew it was unlike her to complain, but they had been walking for a couple of hours, with little purpose and no change of scenery. "Can't we go back to the TARDIS?" She looked him over. His brown jacket, white straw hat, and paisley scarf. An umbrella hung from his breast pocket. He gave that innocent, "But aren't you enjoying yourself?" look, which she remembered Stan Laurel doing when caught out by his wife in Sons of the Desert. She liked old black and white comedies. She and the Doctor had gone to a 1980s Laurel and Hardy convention in Ulverston, Lancashire. The Doctor had recited stories about his old friend Arthur Jefferson. The fans had thought the Doctor was in fancy dress. She had given up trying to tell him how ridiculous he looked, not because he didn't listen to her, but because she felt he did it deliberately, to be different. "Here," he handed her the yo-yo. "Wind it back. We'll need it later." She refused to take it from him. She had a feeling about this planet. She couldn't describe it. She found it easier to moan about her companion. She was about to tell him that she wasn't his slave, when suddenly the air was cut by a piercing scream. Bernice turned to the Doctor. "I didn't hear that, did I?" "Hear what? Come on, we need to keep walking." He held his hand out to help her along, but she knocked it aside. "I can walk." Elle heard the scream. It was the cry of one of the blackbirds. She had never seen one close up, but had seen them swarm in their thousands like phoenixes rising from some age-old ashes, clouding the sky as they flew overhead. She had never shown much interest in nature. She smiled to herself. At the time of the crisis threatening the Althosian system, they had come to this forbidden world, although there was a sentence of death on anyone who approached the planet, so that her husband could carry out tests on the water. He never discussed his research with her, but the whole idea of coming to this inhospitable world struck her as the height of stupidity. She couldn't think why they had done it. She mustn't think. The heat was unbearable, and a purple haze was rising from the river. She sat down on the bank. She looked closely at the water. It seemed to be thickening. There was a red foam on the surface of the grey liquid. "Jarek!" she called. He eventually wandered over, his mind distracted with complicated thoughts and scenarios. She was embarrassed at interrupting him, but thought he would want to see the state of the water. "Yes, this is extraordinary. I didn't expect this yet," he said to himself, apparently seeing this as further evidence to support his theories. "What will the Academy say when we get back?" she asked, wondering how he would explain his visit to this world. "I don't know." "Have you even thought about it?" she asked, although obviously he hadn't. "You need to have an explanation ready. You'll have to explain why you came to this planet before they'll listen to anything else you have to say." He put his arm around her. "Just be glad that I'm here to protect you." She shook his arm off her. "I must have a sample," he said, and returned to the tent to collect a test tube. He smiled and knelt down to look closely at the water. There didn't seem to be any sound coming from the river. There was an unnatural silence. The river looked a misty red colour. He lowered his hand towards the water. His hand went into the liquid. He shot back up, screaming. He lay on the ground in excruciating pain, crying and unable to keep still. He was writhing in agony. Elle moved towards him. There was a wound on his left hand, pulsating and throbbing. "Help me!" he screamed. She grabbed him by the right arm and pulled him from the water's edge. He screamed. Desperately, she looked around for the emergency medical supplies, eventually finding them in the tent. Jarek wasn't moving. He had fainted. Pain was sending shockwaves through his body. Sores covered his skin, looking like the injuries of someone who had fallen into broken glass. She stood over him and felt powerless to help. His body seemed to petrify. His eyes were staring at her. He was unable to shout. She thought she could hear one of the animals in the distance on this unspeakable planet, cackling and laughing to itself. She screamed out, "Shut up! Just shut up!" The jungle once again descended into silence. Crash! Bernice stopped. Although the light filtered through the trees, it was a dark, shadowy world, and the source of the noises, although its direction was impossible to locate, seemed to be coming closer all the time. The doctor kept on walking towards the sounds. He showed an increasing interest in the ground. He pointed out compressed grass, broken twigs, and footprints formed in the soil. From this information, he could apparently work out the size of the life forms, their diet, sleeping patterns, how long since they had passed by, and in what direction. Bernice was surprised when they found the first evidence of life on the planet. She had imagined huge, hairy creatures with large teeth and a nose for blood, but the little reptiles resembled the smaller dinosaurs which had once been extant on Earth, fast of foot, vegetarian, and extremely docile. The creatures were eating leaves and berries from the ground-level plants. She approached them, and as they paid no attention to her, she touched one carefully and felt the rough hide. The doctor pulled her arm away. "Be careful. Appearances can be deceptive. It may have parasites under the skin, which would find your blood very tasty." He was serious, and slowed his voice down in order to scare her. "Beware the monsters." Movement through the jungle was slow. Although they had been trained for jungle warfare during survival courses on Nicaea, the well-designed simulations couldn't give an accurate feel of moving through a primeval forest. Taking the strictest precautions, Marilyn walked in front with the heat-seeking equipment. Cheney and Thomas kept several meters behind her, watching for any sudden movement. The shape changes could be close by, behind the next tree or a nearby blade of grass. Cheney spoke first. "Lost one boy. Bad mission." "No prisoners," he was told, Marilyn reminded them. Thomas could feel the casual cruelty of his comrades. "No sign of Spike?" he had to ask. Marilyn shook her head, but he had got away with asking. They didn't look at him as if he was weak. "The creatures?" Cheney asked. Marilyn replied, "No sign," as if somehow they could be invisible. "Those blips?" Cheney referred to the heat traces which they had been following for the last 4 hours. "Just echoes, I think," Marilyn said, doubting the machinery which they needed to protect their lives. "How far, though?" Cheney needed something definite to go on. 100 meters northwest, she estimated. "But I'm sure they're not real. Just a product of our advanced technology." She stressed the word advanced to indicate her contempt for the latest equipment. "Okay, let's move," decided Cheney. He had taken on the role of leader. Thomas realized that he was more frightened of his comrades than of what lurked in the jungle. He thought he would feel safer if Spike was with them, but they would have to kill Spike if they found him alive, just in case. Elle had sat with her husband and watched him die. Here she was, alone, in a strange world, with the dead body of her husband. The water was no longer moving. It was as if the river had frozen. It reminded her of a vidscreen documentary she had seen. She remembered seeing the petrified remains of victims of a volcanic eruption. The molten ash had fallen over their bodies and caught them unexpectedly. They remained frozen in time. She began to laugh. Chopra turned quickly. He had sensed death. He gasped and tried to breathe rapidly to take control of this terrible feeling. He then felt a great warmth, and the feeling of the other body's journey was lost to him. "I feel pain," he needed to express the dark, unknown dwelling inside him. He stood against a tree to stop himself collapsing. The struggle through the forest was proving difficult, and Butler had taken to shouting at the Chthons. The Chthons were on edge due to the darkness and the sounds of this strange world. They were superstitious creatures who lived in a halfway state between the real world and that of superstition and dread. They could accept Chopra's visions as much as they could accept the nature of the trees and vegetation around them. The Chthons had been complaining in despair about their mission. They were frightened. They regarded Butler and Swarf with some distrust, and although they allowed them to share in their food and drink, they would not share their thoughts. Chopra had heard Butler telling Swarf that he wanted to kill a Chthon as an example to the others of the results of anything less than strict obedience. Swarf said that the rocks they had seen on the ground indicated that they were close to the edge of the jungle. Then the journey would begin to get easier. Neither Butler nor Swarf showed any interest in the parachutists. "Soon it will be too late for them to interfere. Don't worry, Mr. Chopra," Butler had tried to reassure him. "I do worry. This is a bad place," replied Chopra, fighting off the small mites which seemed to be trying to drink his blood. "I have cast the stones." "Superstition! I hope you won't allow childish fears to interfere with your work. Mr. Swarf wouldn't like that." "You know the history of this planet." Before he could finish, Butler grabbed hold of him and lifted him several inches off the ground. He felt pain, sheer excruciating pain. Butler spoke to him in a low murmur, and although he could barely hear, he knew what the shape-changer was telling him. Swarf was smiling, appreciating the pain, and watching for any unrest amongst the dozen Chthons. "I could destroy you, but not yet," said Butler. "A diversion, perhaps, Mr. Butler," said Swarf. Butler also smiled and threw Chopra to the ground. Chopra sank to his knees, coughing and gasping for breath. "Would you like to see some real magic?" Butler asked. Chopra looked up as he heard the sound of cracking bones. It wasn't an illusion. The dwarf was changing shape. His face was elongating, narrowing around the mouth and thickening on the forehead. Bulbous horns were growing out of his face. Thick brown hair was breaking out on the surface of his body. His clothes ripped as the dwarf grew into a 3-meter giant. Teeth protruded from the skin around his mouth. Hooves erupted in place of his hands and feet. A scaly tail grew out of the base of his back, and the creature fell onto all fours. This was a Shakras, which had once roamed the planet Zabo, attacking and butchering the first colonists. Its foul breath polluted the air, its hide stank, and it moved close to lick Chopra's face. He felt sick and wretched over the ground. The apparition stood in front of him, breathing, stinking, perspiring. The shape-changers enjoyed terrifying weaker life forms. Chopra felt frightened. The shape-changers did not understand. They were blind to the true purpose of their deeds. Butler raised its front legs into the air, halting its hooves before they stamped down on Chopra's body. It roared deep into the jungle, a howling animal cry.